This recording is going to look at the Gallagher question focusing on CVP analysis. So again, make sure you read down through the question, attempt it yourself, and then we'll walk through each of the requirements just to explain what exactly was been asked. So the background of this question here is John Gallagher's business manufactures desk diaries, and he's looking to see can he use management accounting techniques, particularly CVP analysis, cost volume profit analysis, to make better decisions or at least get better information to support decision making. So you're told he reckons he's going to sell 300,000 units over the next period. Selling price €12 a unit, variable cost 5 and fixed cost 1.6 million. So the first thing you're asked, which is A1, is be careful now, you're asked for the contribution margin ratio. So you're not actually asked for contribution per unit, which you have to get this figure, but just watch what you're actually asked for. Contribution margin ratio and the break-even point in units. So that's the number of diaries you have to sell to break even, and the euro amount, so the level of sales. So to get your CPU, as we call it, contribution per unit, so we'll bring that down. Your CPU is taking your sales price and you take off your variable cost. So to get contribution margin ratio, you first have to get your contribution. The sales price is 12, the variable cost is 5. So that means for every diary you make what we call contribution of 7. So you get 7 extra euro to contribute towards fixed cost. That's where the phrase comes from. It contributes towards your fixed cost. So your contribution per unit is 7. So that's per diary. And remember, if you looked at the margin video before, the contribution margin is essentially just your CPU divided by your sales price. We want to say you put a profit figure, in this case contribution, the 7 divided by the 12. So here your contribution margin is 7 over 12, or is 58.3%. 58.3%. So what does that mean in English? It means for every euro of sales you make, about 58 cents of that falls to contribution, and you can use that then to pay off some of your fixed cost. So that's our starting point. We then have to get the break-even point. So your break-even point is your fixed cost divided by your CPU. In English, what do we want to do? We want to figure out how many diaries do we have to make so that we can pay off the 1.6 million. Each diary makes €7 contribution. So it's simply going to be 1.6 million divided by 7. So your break even in units is 1600 divided by 7. You're going to have to sell about 228,500 diaries. So that's in units, which is the first part of the question. So that's how many diaries, and if you sell that amount of diaries times 7, it'll just earn enough contribution to pay off your fixed costs. And that is what's called your break-even point. You neither make a profit nor a loss. So then the revenue you need to earn is really just the units times the sales price, 228,571 times your 12, because you're selling each of them at €12. So you're going to earn, you need to earn about 2.7 million euro of revenue to break even. Now you're not asked for it here, but let's just prove that's correct. So if you earn sales of your 2.7 million, your costs, or your variable costs should I say, this is just to prove that this is the break-even point. Your variable cost will be 228,571 diaries times 5. Now I'm doing minus 5 to get it to the cost, because each diary you make has a variable cost or an incremental cost of 5. That leaves you a contribution, if you take one from the other, of exactly 1.6 million. So what we know straight away now is, when you take off your fixed costs, your actual profit for the year will be nil. So we know there we're correct, and you can always just sense check that very quickly just to make sure you've done the right break-even calculation. We can prove here that if we sell 228,500 diaries, we'll just break even. Our contribution will just cover our fixed costs. Your A part 2 then is looking at a measure, I suppose, of safety. It's called your margin of safety. How much can the sales fall by? So current sales at 300 break-even sales, in this case, are 228,571. So you have a margin of safety, we'll call it in units. So there's two ways of presenting the margin of safety, in units and in percentage terms. So the margin of safety in units is essentially what are we selling over what the break-even is. So we have a margin of safety there about 71,400 units. So that means our sales can drop by that amount before we start making a loss. Or more than likely for margin of safety, we present it as a percentage. It'll be the 71 divided by our current sales. So we want to get by how much percent can our sales fall before we break even. Again, a very practical insight that you could use for decision making. And that answer there, if you bring it out to 1, is 23.8%. So remember, you are asking the question, explain what it means. That means our sales can fall by nearly a quarter before we start to make a loss. So you have a decent enough margin of safety there before you'll start to become loss making. Right, so that deals with your margin of safety and what it means. We then go on and we look at A3, which is asking us for what's called a target profit analysis. Another fairly practical question is, well, how many units do we need to sell to make a minimum profit of 750? So remember here, if we sell 228, we make no profit at all. So how we do a target profit is you say the units required equals target profit plus your fixed costs divided by your contribution per unit. Now think about it, that should be relatively intuitive. When we're looking for break even, we're just looking to cover fixed costs. So we don't put in the target profit and we say it's 1.6 over 7. Whereas now not only do we want to cover the 1.6, we also want to make 750 of extra profit. So we need to add that on as an extra requirement. So that is what it's going to look like now. You need to cover the 1.6, but you also need to cover the target profit of 750. So the target units there, or the units required, will be 2350, so 2.35 million divided by 7. Which gets you 335,714 units. So if you produce or sell 335,714, you will make a profit of 750. Now there's a number of ways going about that, and I'm not overly concerned because there's plenty of ways that are acceptable as long as you come to the same figure and you understand the logic that you've used. A lot of times students accidentally get there and wouldn't be able to replicate it in an exam. Again, just to prove that again, it's no harm every so often, particularly for tutorial purposes. Well, is my number correct? If I do sell 335,714, what does my profit figure look like? Well, if I sell that, I'm going to have that times 12 will be my revenue because I sell each of them for €12 a unit. My variable costs will be that times 5, which gets me to 1.6 million variable costs. My contribution is one minus the other, 2350. So think about it, that's the figure we wanted. Take off our fixed costs, which are 1.6, and your profit that you're left with, if you sell that amount of units, is your 750 that we wanted. So again, a clear point there is no harm to sense check early on, are you coming up with the right figure? But you see how CVP can be used there for very practical insight. If you have a target profit in mind, you can work back to the number of units. So for part B then, we're looking at, I suppose, another practical scenario of they're looking to change their cost structure. So you're told here by purchasing some new equipment, the variable cost could be reduced to 450. However, fixed cost would increase to 1.8 million. Now this is what we're looking at here is the different operating leverage. And the concept that in this example, it looks like John Gallagher is trying to automate some of his business. He's bringing in more fixed costs, about 200 grand, but he's reducing down the variable cost per unit by 50 cents. So it could be the case that you're replacing some labor intensive part of the manufacturing process with some fixed cost through automation. But this will change your break even now and change your contribution. So you have to look at, we'll compare and contrast the existing one versus the new one. You're changing your operating leverage, the mix of fixed costs and variable costs in your cost structure. So you're asked to calculate the contribution margin ratio again and the break-even point if the new equipment is acquired. Your sales price doesn't change. It's still 12, but now your variable costs are gone to 450. So they're reduced by 50 cents, meaning your contribution per unit now is actually increased. For every calendar that you sell, you're now making €7.50 contribution. However, that has to be weighed up with the additional fixed costs, which are now 1.8 million. So they're gone up by 200 grand. Right, so there's a trade-off there. So your contribution margin here will be 750 over 12. So your contribution margin is gone up from 58 up to 62.5%. So for every extra unit you sell, you're making more contribution. However, you have more fixed costs to cover early on, and that will show up in your break-even point. Your break-even point now is your fixed costs over your contribution per unit. So here it will be 1.8 million divided by 7.5. So now that is 240,000 units, or in this case it's diaries. So think about how that compared to A part 1. In A part 1 you only need to sell 228,000. Now you need to sell 240,000. So you have a higher break even because your fixed costs are higher. So you have a higher amount to cover early on. And in revenue that will be 240 times 12. So you need to earn 2.88 million euro. So you can see there that changing the cost structure does impact on the overall targets. You now have a higher break even. So there's a more of a risk that you're going to be loss making early on. But the benefit of this is if you get to higher volumes, you make more per unit. So what this cost structure is useful, discuss the change. You're increasing your fixed costs. It increases your break even, but it also builds capacity. So that's what automation does. You bring in automated manufacturing process. You have more capacity. So ideally you're getting higher volumes. And at higher volumes, you're making more profit per unit because your variable costs are low. So that's the trade-off. At lower fixed cost, you have a lower break even, but you have probably less contribution per unit. So it's the weighing up between what's your volume objectives and what you think you're going to earn per unit as well. In this case, you've changed your cost structure. You have a higher degree of operating leverage. They are a higher break even, which increases the risk, albeit slightly. But it does provide increased capacity to generate profits beyond the break even point. So once you hit break even, you'll be a lot more profitable than you were in A part 1. Right, so that answers your B, part 1 and 2, computed, and then there's an element of discussion around operating leverage and the impact on break even. This has increased the break even from 228,000 units up to 240. And the last part in this question then is part C, which is a tricky enough one. So don't cover part C until you've done multi-product break even. Because in realistic terms, in the real world, we don't just have a single product. We have multiple products in a portfolio. So that means we need to figure out, well, how do we do CVP when you have multi-products? So you're told here, as well as the diaries, they're looking at manufacturing calendars as well. It's a common product. These have a selling price of 10 and a variable cost of 550. So sales price 10. We'll call it variable cost is 550. To put that as a minus. So your contribution per calendar here is 450. So you're making €4.50 per every calendar, but that means the total fixed cost will go up by 400 grand. So we're ignoring part B now. We're just looking at the original information where the fixed costs were 1.6 and now they're going up to 2. In terms of output, it's expected that for 3 times as many diaries, so 3 diaries for every 1 calendar. So that's your sales mix. So for every 4 units you sell, 75% of them will be calendars, 25% will be 75% will be diaries, 25% will be calendars. And that's what's called your sales mix. You need to have an assumed sales mix to do the break even where you have multiple products. And we're assuming here 75% of our sales will be diaries, 25% will be calendar. And how you do a multi-product break even is, so multi-product break even is just your fixed cost as normal over your weighted average CPU. So what's the weighted average CPU based on your sales mix? You get the weighted contribution. We know the contribution CPU for the calendar is 4.5. We know the CPU for the original diary. So remember, we're using the original information here, as you're told in the question. That is 7. And you're going to sell 25% of the calendar, 75% of your mix will be the diary. So what we're saying, on average, you'll have a quarter earning $4.50 per unit, 3/4 of your products will earn €7 a unit. So to get the weighted average CPU, you multiply 25% times 4.5 plus 75%, which is 0.75 in the calculator, times 7. So your weighted average will be 0.25 times, that should be 4.5. So it'll be 0.25, which is 25%, times €4.50 for each calendar, plus 0.75, which is 75% in the calculator, times 7. So your weighted average contribution per unit, the weighted average. And the weight that you use here is your sales mix. So what we're saying, on average, every unit that we sell makes a contribution per unit of 6.375. Some of them make less, some of them make more, but on average, it's that. And we need a single figure to do our break even. So your break even then will be 1 or 2 million, which is your fixed costs, divided by 6.375, which is 313,725 units in total. And that's important that it's in total. So between calendars and diaries, you need to sell 313,725. But remember, they're asking you determine the break-even point, but we need to figure out, well, what split does that mean? That's not really meaningful because we don't know, well, how many calendars does that mean? How many diaries? And how you split it is 25% of those will be calendars, 75% will be diaries. So the calendar, 313 times 0.25 and 313 times 0.75. So in terms of the break even, you're going to sell about 78,000 calendars, and diaries you're going to sell about 235,000. So that's how you split it. So that's the key thing about how you approach a multi-product break even. You calculate the weighted average CPU, you get the total break even, and then you split it based on the sales mix. So in CVP, we have a restrictive assumption. You have to use a constant sales mix. You have to make some assumption. What proportion of each product are you going to sell in the forthcoming period? And if we sell calendars of 78 times 4.5 plus 235 times 7, it will get you to your 2 million. You'll earn 2 million contribution to cover your fixed costs. So you go back and make sure you can prove that to see, does that actually break even? So for example, just to prove, if we do for example, your 78431 times 450, because that's how much the calendars earn per contribution, plus your 235,294 times 7, because that's how much the diaries earn, we should hopefully get back to 2 million. And that'll be the contribution earned, which will just cover our fixed costs. And when contribution just covers fixed cost, then you have break even. You neither make a profit, nor do you make a loss. And thankfully, it works out to 2 million contribution. Okay, so again, go back and look at that Halo question in the question pack about how to deal with multi-product break even. The final one then is just an application we've seen already. your target profit analysis, determine the quantity of both products, calendars and diaries, in order to generate a profit of 900. So your target profit. So the units required will be, as before, your target profit plus your fixed costs divided by the weighted average CPU. So it's nothing different than we did before. Now, not only do we need to cover the 2 million fixed costs, we need to cover another 900,000 target profit. So it's going to be 900,000 plus 2 million divided by 6.375. So we need to sell units to make a total contribution of 2.9 million. Because when the total contribution equals 2.9, then we have break even. We just cover our fixed costs. So that will get us the units required of 454,000. And of course, it has to be bigger than here because we need to make a profit. So you're going to have to sell nearly 140,000 more units. Units in total. And as before, we need to split that. We need to sell 25%, which will be a calendar, 75%, which will be the diaries. Because you are asked, and just be careful of what you're asked the question, you're asked to determine the quantity of both products. So if you don't give me that, you will lose a mark or two. So a quarter of 454 is 113. 113,000 calendars, and 3 quarters multiplied by 0.75 is 341,176 diaries. And again, if we want to prove that, just to be clear, so if you want to prove that, you'll go calendar times 450. So each calendar we sell earns a contribution of 450, and each diary we sell, which is 341,176, earns a contribution of 7. So if we've done our target profit analysis correctly, this will come out to 2.9 million, because it will cover the fixed cost of 2, and it'll give us a target profit left over of 900 grand. And thankfully, that's the result we get. So always use your knowledge of CVP to sense check your answer. So for part 1, we got the break even. Now I should have done that in revenues as well. So in euros, it's just calendars will be times 10. So it'll be 784,000, and diaries will be times 12. So just be careful, even I missed that one there. You need to give the 2 answers out, and you'll see that in the solution. We then say, well, actually, we just don't want to break even, we want to make a profit. Then you're going to have to sell more of each. Right. So again, this question was just looking at CVP analysis. Part A and B looked at a single product. Part C then is starting to layer on more in the real world, where you have multiple products in a portfolio, and you need to get the weighted average CPU. The next questions you should be looking at, which have screencasts as well, are then Concert Co, and finally then Peter Allen.